At my granddaughter's wedding, a glance at my name tag sent a chill down my spine. It read, "The old lady who's paying for everything. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached." I'd always believed that family celebrations should be purely moments of joy, brimming with warmth and love. My granddaughter Jennifer's wedding was meant to be one of those perfect days, the kind you cherish forever. Instead, it became the day I truly understood how my family saw me. That morning, I spent extra time preparing. At 65, I'm not overly concerned with vanity, but I wanted to look my absolute best. I chose the pale blue dress Robert, my late husband, had always adored, carefully styled my silver hair, and even applied a delicate touch of the perfume he'd given me for our last anniversary, before cancer took him 3 years ago. "You look beautiful, Alice," I murmured to my reflection, almost hearing Robert's gentle voice, feeling his comforting presence right there beside me. The ceremony at St. Mark's Church was truly beautiful. Jennifer looked radiant as she walked down the aisle, her face glowing with unadulterated happiness. My son, Richard, beamed with undeniable pride as he escorted her, and even my daughter-in-law, Pamela, seemed genuinely moved. For those fleeting moments, everything felt perfectly right, exactly as it should be. It was at the reception where the facade shattered, and everything changed irrevocably. I arrived at the grand ballroom of the Westbrook Hotel, making my way toward the check-in table where guests were collecting their name tags and finding their table assignments. The young woman behind the table smiled warmly as she efficiently shuffled through the alphabetized cards. "Here you are, Mrs. Edwards," she said cheerfully, extending my name tag toward me. I looked down, fully expecting to see simply Alice Edwards, grandmother of the bride. Instead, in elegant calligraphy, were the words, "The old lady who will pay for everything, my gal." My hand froze mid-air. Surely, I thought, this must be a mistake. "Is something wrong?" the young woman asked, noticing the sudden shift in my expression. I forced a smile, my lips feeling stiff. "There seems to be a mix-up with my name tag," I managed to say. She leaned closer to examine it, and her eyes widened in obvious surprise. "Oh, I'm so terribly sorry," she stammered. "Let me check if there's another one." "It's fine," I interjected quickly, not wanting to create any sort of scene, especially not at Jennifer's wedding. "I'll speak with my family about it." With a heavy heart, I pinned the offensive tag to my dress, my cheeks burning with a humiliation so profound it felt like a physical wound, and made my way into the bustling ballroom. Had Jennifer approved this? Had Richard? Pamela? Who on earth thought this was appropriate, let alone humorous? Throughout the cocktail hour, I desperately tried to compose myself and enjoy the festivities, chatting with other guests who either didn't notice my name tag or were simply too polite to mention it. Then, a hushed conversation drifted to my ears, and the words made my blood run cold. "Did you see the grandmother's name tag?" someone whispered, followed by a barely suppressed snicker. "Pamela said they thought it would be hilarious." Another voice replied, "Apparently, she's their personal ATM." My heart plummeted. I moved away quickly, my hands trembling uncontrollably. Just then, Richard spotted me across the room and waved me over to a group of well-dressed guests. "Mom," he called, his voice carrying across the room. "Come meet the Andersons. Dad used to golf with Bill." I approached reluctantly. Bill Anderson looked vaguely familiar, perhaps one of Robert's business associates. "Mom, this is Bill and Martha Anderson," Richard announced, then added with a dismissive laugh, "Mom, our walking bank account." Martha Anderson's smile faltered noticeably as her gaze fell upon my name tag. and Bill looked distinctly uncomfortable. "Alice Edwards," I stated firmly, extending my hand. "Robert's widow." "Of course," Bill said kindly, his voice warm. "Robert spoke of you often. He was very proud of you." The conversation continued around me, but I barely registered it. When the Andersons finally moved on, I pulled Richard aside. "What is the meaning of this?" I demanded, pointing to the offending name tag. Richard merely laughed again. "Oh, Mom, don't be so sensitive. It's just a joke. Everyone knows you're the one with the deep pockets since Dad left you everything." "It's humiliating," I said quietly, my voice tinged with pain. "Oh, please," he scoffed, rolling his eyes. "Lighten up. It's a party." Before I could even formulate a response, Pamela appeared, elegant in her mother-of-the-bride dress. "There you are, Alice. Has Richard been introducing you around? We want everyone to know who's responsible for this gorgeous wedding." She winked, and both of them burst into laughter. Feeling utterly overwhelmed, I excused myself and headed straight for the restroom, desperate for a moment of solitude. As I dabbed at my eyes with a tissue, the door opened, and an older gentleman in a well-tailored suit entered, then quickly backed out, apologizing. "Mrs. Edwards, Alice?" he called tentatively from outside. "It's Martin Reynolds, Robert's attorney. Could I have a word?" I composed myself as best I could and stepped out. Martin had handled Robert's estate with such kindness, and I couldn't help but notice his gaze subtly flicker toward my name tag. "And some of the comments," he added, his voice low. I sighed. "Apparently, it's just a joke." Martin's expression darkened instantly. "It's not funny," he stated, his voice firm, and Robert would have been furious. He hesitated for a moment, then lowered his voice even further. "There's something you should know." "Something Robert insisted I not tell you, unless it became absolutely necessary." He reached into his inner jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope. "This is a codicil to Robert's will. He added it shortly before he passed." I opened it with trembling fingers and began to read. The legal language was undeniably complex, but the core meaning was chillingly clear. Any descendant who publicly humiliated me would be disinherited from their share of Robert's fortune. A fortune, I now realized with a jolt, that was far larger than even I had ever imagined. I looked up at Martin, utterly stunned. "Why wouldn't he tell me this?" I whispered. "He hoped it would never be needed," Martin explained quietly. "He wanted them to treat you right because they loved you, not because they feared losing their inheritance." My gaze drifted back toward the ballroom where my family continued to celebrate, completely unaware that their thoughtless behavior had just cost them millions. "What do you want to do?" Martin asked softly. I carefully folded the document and handed it back to him. "Nothing," I said, a new resolve hardening my voice. "Not yet. I need to see just how far they'll go." As I returned to the reception, the name tag, once a symbol of humiliation, now felt remarkably different against my chest. But now, instead of shame, I felt something entirely different stirring inside me. A quiet, yet fierce, determination to finally see my family for who they truly were, without the rose-tinted glasses I had worn for so long. The morning after Jennifer's wedding, I sat alone at my kitchen table, still in my bathrobe, staring intently at the offensive name tag I'd placed directly in front of me. The elegant calligraphy now seemed to mock me, proclaiming, "The old lady who will pay for everything." I traced the letters with my fingertip, a vivid memory surfacing of how Robert would have reacted if he'd ever seen such a thing. His temper, though rarely unleashed, was formidable when someone he loved was disrespected. They've changed, I whispered to the empty room, as if Robert could hear me from beyond. Or perhaps they were always this way, and we just didn't want to see it. I rose from the table and walked into the living room, my gaze drawn to the large family portrait hanging above the fireplace. It had been taken 5 years ago, on our 40th wedding anniversary. Robert sat in the center, still robust despite the early signs of the illness that would later claim him. I stood beside him, my hand resting gently on his shoulder. Richard and Pamela flanked us, their smiles wide, and Jennifer and her brother Michael, then teenagers, stood in front. We looked happy. We looked, truly, like a family. When exactly had things begun to change? The question haunted me as I prepared my morning tea. Perhaps it had been a slow, insidious process, so subtle that I hadn't noticed the gradual erosion of respect until it was far too late. The first clear memory of this shift surfaced, unbidden, just 6 months after Robert's funeral. Richard and Pamela had invited me to dinner, a rare occurrence even then. They had been unusually attentive that evening, asking about my well-being, reminiscing warmly about Robert. Then, over dessert, they had finally broached the real purpose of their invitation. "Mom," Richard had begun, refilling my wine glass. "Pamela and I have been thinking about remodeling our kitchen. Nothing fancy, just updating the appliances, new countertops, that sort of thing." "That sounds lovely," I had replied, completely oblivious to what was coming next. "The thing is," Pamela continued smoothly, her voice laced with a hint of practiced concern, "with college tuition for the kids and everything else, we're a bit stretched right now." I distinctly remembered the pause, the expectant, almost hungry looks they exchanged. "Are you asking me for money?" I had asked, my voice cautious. "Not asking, exactly," Richard had quickly clarified, a practiced smile on his face. "It's just that Dad left you quite comfortable, and we thought maybe you'd want to help out the family." I had written them a check for $30,000 that very evening. Looking back now, that had been the undeniable beginning. Small requests soon escalated into larger ones. A kitchen remodel morphed into a full home renovation. Tuition assistance somehow translated into luxury cars for both Jennifer and Michael the moment they turned 18. Family vacations, which I was always invited to join, came with the unspoken expectation that I would fund them entirely. I walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a dusty box of financial records. Sitting on the floor like a schoolgirl, I began meticulously sorting through bank statements and canceled checks. The evidence of my extensive financial support for Richard and Pamela's increasingly lavish lifestyle was overwhelming. In just over 3 years, I had given them nearly $250,000. The sudden ring of the phone interrupted my sobering tally. It was Pamela. "Alice, are you home? I've been calling your cell phone." I hadn't even noticed my cell phone was still in my evening purse. "Yes, I'm home. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Pamela chirped. "Richard and I just wanted to thank you for everything yesterday. Wasn't the wedding beautiful?" "Yes, it was lovely," I replied, my voice flat. "Jennifer and Mark are so grateful for your generosity. They couldn't have had such a wonderful wedding without you." I closed my eyes, remembering the $45,000 check I'd written for the venue and catering, the lion's share of the cost. I was happy to help. "Actually, that's partly why I'm calling," Pamela continued, her voice taking on that syrupy, manipulative quality I'd come to recognize all too well. "Mark's parents were supposed to pay for the honeymoon, but his father's business has been struggling, and they've had to back out. Jennifer is just devastated." I could hear what was coming next, the familiar pattern. "We were wondering if you might be able to help. They've got their hearts set on 2 weeks in Bali. Richard and I would contribute, of course, But with everything we spent on the wedding, everything they spent, I thought bitterly. I had covered almost all of it. I'll think about it, I said, surprising both myself and Pamela with my non-committal response. There was a pregnant pause on the other end of the line. Oh, well, they need to book soon to get the best rates, she pressed. I understand. I'll let you know tomorrow. After hanging up, I returned to my financial archaeology. Robert had always warned me about Richard's relationship with money. He sees it as the solution to everything, he'd told me once, his voice laced with concern. But money without values just creates more problems. I hadn't understood then, or perhaps I hadn't wanted to understand the depth of his insight. A gentle knock at the door startled me. Through the peephole, I saw Michael, my grandson, shifting nervously on the porch. I quickly gathered up the scattered financial papers and stashed them back into the closet before opening the door. "Grandma?" he said, stepping forward to hug me. At 21, he was tall like his grandfather, with the same kind, discerning eyes. "Are you okay? I've been texting you." "I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a bit tired after yesterday. Come in." He followed me to the kitchen, where I put on the kettle for fresh tea. Michael had always been different from the rest of them, more thoughtful, less fixated on appearances and status. "I wanted to apologize for yesterday," he said, sitting at the table, his gaze sincere. "The name tag, the way everyone was talking, it wasn't right." I felt a lump form in my throat. "You noticed?" "Of course I noticed. So did a lot of people," he confirmed, looking down, embarrassed. I should have said something. I reached across the table and patted his hand gently. "It's not your responsibility to correct your parents, Michael. But it is my responsibility to stand up for what's right." He looked at me directly, his gaze unwavering. "Dad and Mom, they've really changed since Grandpa died. Or maybe I just didn't see it before. All they talk about is money. Your money, specifically." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart pounding a little faster. Michael hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "Last week, I overheard them discussing your house. Dad said something about how it's too big for one person and how they could help you downsize." The kettle whistled, giving me a moment, a precious moment, to fully absorb this alarming information. As I poured the hot water over the tea bags, I thought about Martin Reynolds and the codicil to Robert's will. I thought about the name tag, the relentless requests for money, and now, this audacious plan to move me out of my beloved home. "Grandma?" Michael's voice, full of concern, brought me sharply back to the present. "Are you sure you're okay?" I set the teapot on the table and sat down across from him, meeting his gaze. "I'm better than okay, Michael. I think I'm finally seeing things clearly for the first time in years." "What do you mean?" he asked, puzzled. I smiled, a new resolve hardening my features. "Just that it's time for some changes around here." As we sipped our tea, I found myself studying my grandson's face, wondering if he was truly different from his parents, or if the seeds of entitlement were merely dormant, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. For the first time since Robert died, a cold, sharp clarity replaced my pervasive grief and loneliness. I wouldn't be making any hasty decisions, but I would be watching and waiting to see who in my family truly deserved the legacy Robert had so carefully left behind. 3 days after the wedding, Richard and Pamela organized a post-wedding brunch at their country club. I deliberated whether to attend, but a deep-seated curiosity ultimately won out. I needed to see if the name tag incident had been an isolated anomaly or part of a more deeply ingrained pattern. I arrived at the Oak Ridge Country Club dressed in a simple but elegant cream pantsuit, one that Robert had always said made me look regal. As I entered the private dining room, I noticed several familiar faces from the wedding, including Jennifer and her new husband, Mark, Michael, and various relatives and friends. "Mom, over here!" Richard called, waving me toward the head table. Pamela, resplendent in a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, gave me a fleeting air kiss. "Alice, you look nice," she said, her tone suggesting mild surprise, even a hint of condescension. "We saved you a seat right here." I settled into the chair, noting with a pang that I'd been placed next to Mark's parents, whom I barely knew, rather than closer to my own grandchildren. The brunch proceeded pleasantly enough, a polite hum of conversation filling the room, until Pamela clinked her glass with a spoon, demanding attention. "We want to thank everyone for coming today and for helping make Jennifer and Mark's wedding so special," she began, her voice ringing with performative gratitude. "And of course, a very special thank you to Grandma Alice, who has been so incredibly generous." All eyes in the room turned to me. "In fact," Pamela continued, her smile not quite reaching her eyes, a calculating glint replacing genuine warmth, "we have an exciting announcement. Grandma will be funding Jennifer and Mark's dream honeymoon to Bali." There was a smattering of polite applause. I sat frozen, my coffee cup halfway to my lips, the steaming liquid suddenly seeming to scald my skin. I had made no such commitment. "Mom?" Richard prompted, a hint of impatience in his voice when I didn't immediately acknowledge the announcement. I carefully, deliberately, set my cup down on the saucer. "This is the first I'm hearing of it," I said, keeping my voice level, devoid of any tremor. An awkward, thick silence fell over the entire table. Jennifer looked from her mother to me, her expression shifting from confusion to profound embarrassment. Mark stared intently at his plate, avoiding all eye contact. "Well, we discussed it yesterday," Pamela said, her voice brittle with forced cheerfulness. "Remember? You said you'd think about it?" "Yes, I did say that," I confirmed, my voice unwavering. "And I'm still thinking." Richard leaned over, speaking in a stage whisper, clearly meant to be heard by everyone at the table. "Mom, don't make a scene. We've already told them they can book the trip." I felt something inside me snap, a final thread of my patience that had been stretched too thin, for far too long. "I don't recall agreeing to pay for a honeymoon to Bali," I said, my voice rising just enough to carry across the hushed table. "In fact, I believe Mark's parents were originally planning to cover this expense." Mark's father shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat. "There were some business setbacks," he muttered, his face flushed. "I understand," I said kindly, turning my gaze back to Pamela, a steely glint in my eye. "These things happen, but I think it's entirely inappropriate to publicly volunteer someone else's money without their agreement, don't you?" The table fell silent, the tension palpable. Pamela's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Perhaps Jennifer and Mark might consider a more modest honeymoon?" I suggested, my voice calm but firm. "One within their means." "Their means?" Pamela hissed, her voice sharp with disbelief and sudden fury. "What about your means? Everyone knows Robert left you more than comfortable." Something in her tone, the sheer entitlement, the thinly veiled resentment, made my decision clear. "My financial situation is not up for public discussion," I stated firmly, my voice unwavering. "And neither are my spending choices." Richard grabbed my arm, his fingers digging in painfully. "Mom, stop it! You're embarrassing us!" I pulled my arm away, my gaze unwavering. "No, Richard," I countered, my voice resonating with newfound authority. "You've embarrassed yourselves." I stood up, smoothing down my jacket with a deliberate movement. Jennifer, Mark, I wish you both every happiness. I'd be happy to contribute to a reasonable honeymoon, but I'll discuss that with you privately. As I turned to leave, Michael, bless him, stood up as well. I'll walk you out, Grandma. In the quiet of the lobby, away from prying eyes and the suffocating atmosphere of the dining room, I finally let my composure slip. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my car keys. Are you okay to drive? Michael asked gently, his concern evident. I nodded, taking a deep, shuddering breath. I'm fine, just a bit shaken. You should be proud of yourself, he said, offering a genuine smile. That took courage. I looked at my grandson, truly looked at him in that moment. He reminded me so much of Robert. It made my heart ache with a bittersweet pang. Would you like to come over for dinner tonight? I asked, impulsively. Michael's face lit up. I'd like that very much, Grandma. Later that evening, as we sat in my kitchen, sharing a simple, comforting meal of roast chicken, I found myself confiding in Michael about his parents' behavior over the past 3 years. The constant financial demands, the gradual erosion of respect, the unsettling feeling of being seen only as a source of funds. I'm not surprised, he said sadly, his fork tracing patterns on his plate. I've watched it happening. After Grandpa died, it was like they saw you as, I don't know. An ATM? I supplied, a dry bitterness in my voice. He nodded, his gaze meeting mine. Exactly, and it's getting worse. Last week I overheard them talking about your house again. My breath hitched. What did they say? Michael hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. They were discussing how to convince you to move into Sunrise Acres, the retirement home. I was utterly stunned. My house was my sanctuary, filled with cherished memories of the life Robert and I had meticulously built together. Dad said it would be better for everyone if you downsized. Michael continued, his voice low. He even mentioned something about the real estate market being hot and how they could help you maximize your investment. I felt sick to my stomach. They weren't just after my money. They wanted my home too. Michael, I began, my voice barely a whisper. There's something I need to tell you. Michael, I began, my voice barely a whisper. There's something I need to tell you. I was finally deciding to trust him with the truth about Robert's codicil, the hidden clause that could change everything. But before I could continue, the doorbell chimed, a sharp, unwelcome intrusion. Through the window, I saw Richard's car in the driveway, a grim premonition settling in my chest. It's your father, I said, my voice heavy. Michael's expression hardened, a flicker of defiance in his eyes. You don't have to answer it, Grandma, he offered, but I was done hiding, done avoiding. No, I said, rising from the table, my resolve hardening. I think it's time we cleared the air. I opened the door to find Richard standing there, his face flushed with a furious anger. What the hell was that performance at brunch? He demanded, pushing past me into the hallway without an invitation. Then he spotted Michael, standing quietly behind me. What are you doing here? He sneered. Having dinner with Grandma, Michael replied calmly, his voice even. Something the rest of you might try sometime without asking for money. Richard's face darkened, his jaw clenching. Stay out of this, Michael. This is between your mother and me. No, I said firmly, stepping between them. If we're going to have this conversation, Michael stays. I'm tired of the private manipulations, Richard. Let's put everything on the table, right here, right now. And in that moment, looking at my son's angry, demanding face and my grandson's quiet, protective stance, I knew we had reached the breaking point. there would be no going back. "I've had enough of your attitude, Mom," Richard declared, pacing my living room like a caged animal, his agitation palpable. "First, the scene at the brunch, and now I find you've been poisoning Michael's mind against us." I sat calmly in Robert's old armchair, my hands folded serenely in my lap, observing the spectacle. Michael stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, watching his father with a mixture of disappointment and unwavering resolve. "No one is poisoning anyone's mind," I replied evenly, my voice calm, belying the storm within. "We're simply acknowledging what's been happening in this family since your father died." "And what exactly is that?" Richard demanded, stopping abruptly to glare at me. "You and Pamela have been treating Grandma like a bank, not a person," Michael interjected before I could answer, his voice clear and resonant. "The name tag at the wedding, volunteering her to pay for Jennifer's honeymoon without asking first, talking about selling her house behind her back." "You've been spying on us?" Richard's face flushed a deeper, angrier red. "I've been paying attention," Michael countered, his gaze firm. "Something you might try sometime." Richard turned back to me, his expression abruptly shifting to the unctuous, conciliatory tone he always used when he wanted something, when he was attempting to manipulate. "Mom, you're misunderstanding everything. We're just trying to help you manage your finances wisely. You're not getting any younger." "And I'm 65, Richard, not 95, I interrupted, my voice sharp with indignation. "My mind is perfectly sharp, and I'm more than capable of managing my own affairs." "But Dad left you so much," he insisted, his voice rising in desperation. "Stop!" I held up my hand, cutting him off definitively. "Robert left me exactly what he intended to leave me. His estate is not a family piggy bank for you to raid at will." Richard's false smile vanished completely, replaced by raw anger and naked greed. "So, what are you saying? You're cutting us off because Pamela made one stupid joke with a name tag?" "I'm saying that from now on," I declared, my voice resonating with an unshakable authority. "I'll be making my own decisions about my money, in my own home. If Jennifer and Mark want a honeymoon in Bali, they can save for it like most young couples do. If you and Pamela want a bigger house, you can work for it yourselves." Richard stared at me as if I'd suddenly transformed into a stranger, started speaking a foreign language. Then, his eyes narrowed, and he turned to Michael. "I want to speak to my mother alone." "I'm staying," Michael said firmly, his posture unyielding. "This is family business." "Exactly," Michael replied, meeting his father's gaze without flinching. "And I'm family." Something subtle shifted in Richard's expression, a flicker of calculation, a quick reassessment. He'd always been able to manipulate me when we were alone, playing on my emotions, my lingering grief for Robert, my deep-seated desire to keep the peace. But with Michael present, those manipulative tactics simply wouldn't work. "Fine," he snapped, his voice sharp with frustration as he stomped towards the door. "But this isn't over, Mom. Not by a long shot." After he left, Michael let out a long, slow breath, the tension visibly draining from him. "I'm sorry, Grandma." "For what, sweetheart?" I asked, confused. "You've done nothing wrong." "For not standing up sooner," he clarified, his voice filled with regret. "For letting them treat you this way." I rose from the armchair and hugged him tightly, the warmth of his embrace a comfort. "You're standing up now," I whispered, tears pricking my eyes. "That's what matters." After Michael left, I sat in the quiet of my home, the silence amplifying my thoughts. I thought about Robert, about the codicil to his will, and about the family we had raised together. Had we gone wrong somewhere with Richard? Or had he always possessed this deep streak of entitlement that we had simply failed to see? More importantly, what was I going to do now? The answer came slowly, taking shape in my mind like a photograph developing in a darkroom. Instead of confronting Richard and Pamela directly with the codicil, which would only make them change their behavior out of fear rather than genuine respect, I would simply allow them to continue revealing their true colors. Meanwhile, I would quietly reclaim my life and my independence on my own terms. The very next morning, I called Martin Reynolds. "Alice," he answered warmly, his voice conveying genuine relief. "I've been hoping to hear from you after the wedding." "Yes, that's partly why I'm calling," I confirmed, launching into an explanation of what had happened at the brunch and Richard's subsequent visit. "I need to understand exactly what Robert left in his will, Martin. Not just the codicil, but everything. The full picture." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Perhaps this would be better discussed in person," he suggested gently. "Could you come to my office this afternoon?" 3 hours later, I sat across from Martin in his well-appointed office as he meticulously explained the full extent of Robert's estate. The sheer numbers laid out before me truly took my breath away. "Robert built several companies over his lifetime," Martin explained, his tone respectful, "and sold them at just the right moments. His investments were extremely conservative, which means they weathered the economic downturns beautifully." "I knew we were comfortable," I said faintly, still reeling. "But this—" Robert had always been a private man when it came to money. He hadn't believed in flaunting wealth. Martin offered a small, knowing smile. "He always said you married him when he had nothing but potential and a beat-up Chevy. So he never wanted you to become one of those women who only care about designer labels and country club memberships." I laughed softly, hearing Robert's voice so clearly in those words, that familiar dry wit. "That sounds exactly like him." "As for the codicil," Martin continued, his expression growing more serious, "it's straightforward, but incredibly powerful. Any descendant who publicly humiliates you forfeits their entire inheritance." He paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "The name tag incident at the wedding would certainly qualify. And the brunch? That too, most likely." He looked at me, a question in his eyes. "But Alice, you don't have to trigger it immediately. The codicil is designed to protect you, not just to punish them." "I understand," I replied, a new sense of power settling over me. "I'm not looking for punishment, Martin. I'm looking for respect. Have to make any decisions right now. The codicil remains in effect for your lifetime." I nodded, a thought beginning to crystallize. What if I wanted to make some changes of my own to my will, to how my assets are managed? Martin, ever perceptive, leaned forward slightly. "What did you have in mind?" By the time I left Martin's office, I had a clear, deliberate plan. No dramatic confrontations, no ultimatums, just a quiet, systematic reclaiming of my life and my power. First, I called my old friend Eleanor, whom I hadn't seen much since Robert's death. We arranged to meet for lunch the following day, a simple pleasure I'd long neglected. Then, I stopped by the community center and picked up a brochure for their adult education classes. Robert had always encouraged me to pursue my interest in painting. Perhaps it was time. At home, I sat at my computer and began researching small business loans. Michael had mentioned wanting to open a bookstore after college, but was worried about the startup costs. A genuine investment in my grandson's future seemed like a perfect, meaningful use of some of my resources. When my phone rang and I saw it was Pamela, I let it go straight to voicemail. The old Alice would have answered immediately, anxious about what new emergency or demand might be coming. But that Alice was fading away, replaced by a woman who was finally recognizing her own worth. The voicemail, when I listened to it later, was exactly what I expected. Alice, it's Pamela. Richard told me about your conversation last night. I think there's been a misunderstanding. We've always had your best interests at heart. Richard and I were thinking we should have dinner this weekend to clear the air. Oh, and Jennifer mentioned you'd reconsidered about the honeymoon. They really need to book soon to get the best rates. Call me back. I deleted the message without returning the call. Instead, I opened my checkbook and wrote a modest check as a wedding gift for Jennifer and Mark. Enough for a very nice honeymoon, but perhaps in New England, not Bali. I enclosed it in a card with a warm note wishing them happiness, then sealed the envelope. My silent strategy had begun. No confrontations, no drama, just quiet, firm boundaries. Robert, I knew, would have approved wholeheartedly. 6 months passed in a blur of quiet but significant changes. I enrolled in painting classes at the community center, rediscovering a forgotten passion. I reconnected with old friends, enjoying laughter and companionship that had been missing from my life. And I spent more time with Michael, who visited regularly, his genuine affection a balm to my soul. I provided him with seed money for his bookstore business plan, which was coming along beautifully, a true partnership. Meanwhile, Richard and Pamela's attitude toward me oscillated wildly between chilly distance and desperate, transparent attempts to reestablish their access to my finances. When the silent treatment failed to yield the desired results, they would suddenly appear with forced smiles and flimsy excuses to visit, their pretense thin. Each time, they would inevitably steer the conversation toward money. A renovation they were planning? Jennifer's sudden desire to buy an expensive house with Mark, their own fabricated retirement concerns. Each time, I politely but firmly declined to engage. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my own finances," became my new mantra, delivered with a polite smile that grew more confident with each repetition. They didn't take the rejection well. Pamela's texts became increasingly hostile, her language sharp and demanding. Richard's calls grew more insistent, laced with thinly veiled threats and appeals to my supposed duty. But I had found a new, quiet strength in my silence, in the firm boundaries I was finally enforcing. Today was my birthday, my 66th. And despite my protests, Michael had insisted on organizing a small family gathering right here at my home. "It's time they remember whose house this is," he'd said, with a grim determination that reminded me so much of Robert. I spent the morning in my garden, deadheading roses and drawing deep peace from the simple, grounding task. The garden had been another casualty of the past 3 years. I'd neglected it while catering to Richard and Pamela's ceaseless demands. Now, like me, it was slowly but surely coming back to life. By mid-afternoon, my home was ready for guests, a quiet hum of anticipation in the air. Michael arrived early to help with the final preparations. "Are you sure you're ready for this, Grandma?" he asked gently, arranging cheese and crackers on a platter. "As ready as I'll ever be," I replied, smoothing the fabric of my new dress, a bold, vibrant red I would never have dared to choose before. Besides, it's just dinner. But we both knew it was more than that. This was the first time in months that the entire family would be together, under my roof. Richard and Pamela, Jennifer and Mark, and even a few of Robert's old, trusted friends, including Martin Reynolds. The doorbell chimed precisely at 5 o'clock. Richard and Pamela stood on the porch, their smiles so artificial I could almost hear the plastic stretching. "Happy birthday, Mom," Richard said, handing me a rather uninspired bouquet of store-bought flowers. "Alice, you look different," Pamela added, her eyes narrowing slightly as they took in my new dress, my carefully styled hair, the subtle makeup I'd applied with techniques learned from a class at the community center. "Thank you," I said simply, stepping back to let them enter. Jennifer and Mark arrived moments later, followed by Martin and another couple who had been close friends with Robert and me for decades. I moved through the greetings and small talk with a calm composure I would have found utterly impossible just 6 months ago. As we settled into the dining room, I couldn't help but notice Richard's gaze subtly moving around the house, assessing, calculating. Pamela's eyes, meanwhile, kept returning with an almost disturbed fascination to the new painting hanging prominently on the wall, a vibrant landscape I'd created myself. "Did you redecorate, Alice?" she asked, her tone suggesting she found the changes disturbing, perhaps even offensive. "Just a few updates," I replied, a slight smile playing on my lips. "I've been taking painting classes." "Painting classes?" Richard echoed, as if I'd just announced I was learning to fly spaceships. "Grandma's really talented," Michael interjected proudly, his voice brimming with genuine admiration. "She's already sold 2 pieces at the community art fair." "Sold?" Pamela looked genuinely confused, her brow furrowed. "But why would you need to sell paintings, Alice?" I smiled, a knowing, serene smile. "It's not about need, Pamela. It's about joy." An uncomfortable silence descended upon the table, thick and heavy, finally broken by Mark, who, bless his heart, asked about the bookstore Michael was planning to open. "It's coming along great," Michael said, his enthusiasm palpable. "Thanks to Grandma, I've got the business plan finalized, and I'm looking at locations." Richard's gaze darted to me, a flicker of something akin to alarm in his eyes, as if he'd just realized the extent of my unauthorized activities. Head snapped up, his eyes darting to Michael, then to me. "Thanks to Grandma? What does that mean?" Michael met his father's gaze steadily, unflinching. "Grandma's investing in my bookstore?" "Investing?" Richard's voice rose, a dangerous edge to it. "With what money?" "My money," I said quietly, firmly. "But," Richard began, then caught himself, glancing around at the other guests at the table. "Maybe we should discuss this privately, Mom." "There's nothing to discuss," I replied, my voice unwavering. "I'm making my own financial decisions now." Richard's face darkened further. He looked as if he wanted to say more, but Jennifer, sensing the escalating tension, wisely interrupted with an animated story about their honeymoon to Cape Cod, the destination they'd chosen after receiving my modest gift. The conversation shifted, and the immediate tension diffused, at least temporarily. After dinner, as we moved to the living room for coffee and dessert, Pamela cornered me in the kitchen, her voice a harsh, low whisper. "Alice, what's going on with you?" she demanded, her eyes narrowed. "First, you refused to help with the honeymoon. Then, we hear nothing from you for months, and now you're throwing money at Michael's pipe dream." "It's not a pipe dream," I replied calmly, as I gathered the dessert plates. "It's a solid business plan." "Don't be naive," she scoffed. "Bookstores aren't profitable anymore. He's using you." "No, Pamela," I corrected her, my voice firm. "I'm supporting my grandson's ambition. There's a difference." Her eyes narrowed further, the calculating glint unmistakable. "Richard and I have been talking. We think it's time you consider moving somewhere more manageable. Sunrise Acres has lovely apartments, and the money from selling this house could help all of us." So, there it was, the insidious plan Michael had overheard, now brought openly into the light. "This house isn't for sale," I said firmly, my voice leaving no room for argument. "And my living arrangements are not up for family discussion." Before she could respond, Richard appeared in the doorway, a forced cheerfulness in his tone. "Everything okay in here?" "Just wonderful," I said, picking up the beautiful cake I'd baked that morning. "Shall we have dessert?" In the living room, as I began the ritual of cutting the cake, Richard cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Before we move on, Mom," he began, his voice taking on a formal, almost theatrical tone, "there's something Pamela and I want to discuss with everyone." My hand stilled on the cake knife, a chill running down my spine. This wasn't part of the celebratory evening I had envisioned. "We've been concerned about Mom's decision-making lately," Richard announced to the room, his gaze sweeping over the gathered guests. "She's making unwise financial choices, isolating herself, and refusing family guidance." A stunned, heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the clinking of cutlery on plates. "We think it's time to consider a power of attorney arrangement," he continued, completely oblivious to the discomfort he was causing, "for her own protection." Martin Reynolds, who had been listening intently, set down his coffee cup with deliberate, precise care. "That's a serious step, Richard," he stated, his voice calm but authoritative. "Do you have evidence of diminished capacity?" "She's giving away money to fund a bookstore in the digital age," Richard retorted, as if that fact alone fully explained everything, his voice laced with exasperation. "And she's refusing to consider sensible downsizing options." I felt a strange, almost serene calm settle over me. This moment had been inevitable, I realized, from the very day I'd started saying no. "Your mother seems perfectly competent to me, Richard," Martin observed, his gaze firm. "Making decisions you disagree with is not evidence of incapacity." "You don't understand," Richard insisted, his voice rising, a tremor of desperation entering his tone. "She's always relied on Dad, and then on me, for financial guidance. Now suddenly she's just different. She's making these irrational choices. She's just different." "Enough," I declared, setting down the cake knife with a decisive clatter. "I am not irrational, incapacitated, or in need of your guidance, Richard." "Mom, be reasonable," he pleaded, his voice tinged with desperation. "I've been reasonable for 3 years," I interrupted, my voice gaining strength. "I've paid for renovations, vacations, cars, and a wedding. I've allowed you to treat me like a walking checkbook rather than your mother, but that stops now." Richard's face flushed a dark, furious red. "Is this what you want?" he demanded, gesturing wildly around the table, encompassing all the guests. "To humiliate us in front of everyone? To make us look like villains?" "No, Richard," I said quietly, my gaze unwavering. "You've managed that all on your own." "You selfish old woman," he hissed, standing up so abruptly his chair nearly toppled over. "After everything we've done for you—" "Richard!" Pamela tugged frantically at his arm, suddenly, belatedly, aware of how this looked to the other guests. But Richard was beyond caring, beyond control. "You think you can just cut us off? Dad would be ashamed of you." It was at that precise, explosive moment that Martin Reynolds cleared his throat and spoke the words that would change everything, irrevocably. "Actually, Richard," he said, his voice calm, clear, and utterly authoritative, "your father anticipated this exact situation." The silence that followed Martin's words was absolute, profound. Richard stood frozen, his mouth slightly agape, as Martin reached into his inner jacket pocket and removed a familiar plain brown envelope. "Robert added a codicil to his will shortly before he passed," Martin explained to the stunned room, his gaze sweeping over the speechless faces. "He was concerned about how Alice might be treated after he was gone." "What kind of codicil?" Pamela demanded, finding her voice first, a tremor of fear in it. Martin looked to me, silently asking for permission. I nodded. The codicil states that any descendant who publicly humiliates Alice forfeits their entire inheritance, Martin stated, his voice steady, delivering the blow with clinical precision. This includes treating her with disrespect, attempting to control her finances against her wishes, or trying to force her from her home. "That's ridiculous," Richard sputtered, his voice cracking. "Dad would never—" "He did," Martin interrupted, his tone firm. "And as the executor of his estate, I've been carefully documenting the incidents over the past several months." He turned to me, his expression grave. "Alice, I have to ask, do you want to enforce the codicil?" All eyes in the room, heavy with shock, expectation, and fear, turned to me. I looked at Richard and Pamela, their faces now pale with a dawning horror that slowly eclipsed their earlier anger. I looked at Jennifer, who seemed utterly confused, then deeply embarrassed. Then, I looked at Michael, whose expression held nothing but quiet, unwavering support. "Yes," I said finally, my voice clear and unwavering, resonating with a strength I hadn't known I possessed. "I do." Richard collapsed back into his chair, the air knocked out of him. "You can't be serious," he whispered, disbelief etched across his face. "I've never been more serious," I replied, my gaze fixed on him. The name tag at the wedding, the honeymoon announcement at the brunch, the constant demands for money, and now this audacious attempt to declare me incompetent. All of it stops today. "But our inheritance?" Pamela whispered, her voice barely audible, a frantic plea. "Is forfeit," Martin confirmed, his voice devoid of emotion. "All of it?" Jennifer asked, her voice small, childlike. Martin nodded grimly. "I'm afraid so. The codicil is quite clear." "This isn't fair!" Richard suddenly shouted, slamming his fist on the table, a raw, primal rage erupting. "She tricked us. She let us believe the money was just sitting there, waiting to be used." "No, Richard," I said, my voice calm amid his storm. "I didn't trick you. I merely gave you enough rope to hang yourselves." Quietly. "I never promised you anything. You assumed, you took, you demanded, but you never once asked what I needed or wanted." "What about Jennifer and Mark?" Pamela asked desperately, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "They haven't done anything wrong." Martin consulted his notes. Jennifer was present at several incidents, but didn't actively participate in the humiliation. However, she also never spoke up to defend Alice. Jennifer's eyes immediately filled with tears, her lower lip trembling. "I'm sorry, Grandma. I should have said something at the wedding about the name tag." I reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture of comfort. "We all make mistakes, sweetheart. The question is what we learn from them." "So, what happens now?" Mark asked, putting a comforting arm around Jennifer's shoulder. "Now," Martin said, his voice ringing with finality. "According to the terms of the codicil, Richard and Pamela's share of Robert's estate is redistributed." "To whom?" Richard demanded, his voice strained. "Half goes to Alice outright," Martin explained, his gaze directed at me. "The other half is divided among descendants who have shown her proper respect and care." All eyes turned to Michael, who looked genuinely surprised, his face reflecting a mixture of shock and quiet understanding. "I didn't know," he said quickly, looking at me. "I swear, Grandma, I had no idea about any of this." "I know, sweetheart," I assured him, my voice soft with affection. "Your grandfather would be proud of the man you've become." Richard stood up again, his face contorted with impotent anger. "This is a setup, a conspiracy. I'll contest it in court." "You're welcome to try," Martin said calmly, his composure unshakable. "But the codicil is legally binding, and we have ample evidence of the conditions being met. Alice, Pamela began, her voice suddenly honeyed, pleading. Surely we can work this out as a family. We never meant— Save it, Pamela, I cut in, my voice unwavering. It's too late for that. So that's it? Richard demanded, his voice thick with disbelief and fury. After everything we've done for you, you're just cutting us off? No, Richard, I said, standing to face my son directly, my gaze firm and resolute. After everything I've done for you, I'm finally standing up for myself. There's a difference. The gathering ended shortly after. Jennifer and Mark left with awkward apologies and promises to call soon, their faces etched with a new, somber understanding. Richard and Pamela stormed out without another word, their furious departure leaving a tangible chill in the air. Martin and the other guests made tactful, sympathetic exits, leaving just Michael and me in the sudden, profound quiet of my home. Are you okay? He asked, helping me clear the barely touched dessert plates. I'm better than okay, I replied, surprised to find the truth in my own words. I feel free. 1 year later, I stood in the doorway of Chapter 1, the bookstore Michael had finally opened, in a charming, converted Victorian house downtown. The morning sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating shelves of carefully curated books and inviting, comfortable reading nooks. A cozy coffee counter, staffed by Michael's girlfriend Emma, served locally roasted beans and homemade pastries, filling the air with a comforting aroma. In the children's section, a vibrant mural I had painted covered one entire wall. A whimsical forest scene brimming with hidden animals and tiny fairy houses for young readers to discover. Twice a week, I eagerly led Storytime for neighborhood children, something I'd never imagined myself doing before, finding immense joy in their wide-eyed wonder. The small apartment upstairs had been renovated as a comfortable living space for Michael and Emma, a testament to their hard work and Michael's burgeoning success. Well, not for me. I still loved my home with its cherished memories of Robert. Instead, it was designated for a young writer-in-residence program Michael had established with part of his inheritance, a way to give back to the literary community. The bell over the door jingled, announcing a new arrival, and Jennifer stepped in, gently pushing a stroller with her 3-month-old daughter, Roberta, named tenderly after her grandfather. Grandma! Jennifer called, spotting me instantly. I didn't know you'd be here today. Just dropping off some new bookmarks I painted, I said, bending down to admire baby Roberta, her tiny hands clutching at the air. Hello, little one. Over the past year, Jennifer and I had slowly, carefully rebuilt our relationship. After the initial shock of the inheritance revelation, she had made genuine efforts to connect with me independently of her parents. Mark had proven to be a steadying, sensible influence, quietly encouraging her to form her own opinions rather than simply echoing her mother's. Richard and Pamela were a different story. After several failed, costly attempts to contest the codicil in court, they had finally moved to Florida, where Richard had taken a job with a former business associate. Our communication was now limited to terse Christmas cards and occasional brief updates through Jennifer. Have you heard from your parents lately? I asked as Jennifer settled herself at a small table with the baby, carefully adjusting Roberta's blanket. Mom called last week, she said with a sigh, a familiar weariness in her voice. Same conversation as always. Complaints about Dad's new job, the smaller house they had to settle for, how unfair everything is. I'm sorry, I began, but Jennifer cut me off, her voice firm. Don't be. They made their choices. I've made mine. Emma, Michael's girlfriend, brought over our coffee and fresh scones, cooing over the baby before returning to the counter. Michael emerged from the back room with a stack of new arrivals, his face lighting up when he saw us. Perfect timing, he said, joining us at the table. I wanted to run something by you both. He explained his idea for expanding the store's community programs, including literacy tutoring for adults and writing workshops for teens. It would mean reinvesting some of the profits, he added, a hint of nervousness in his tone. But I think it's worth it. I think it's wonderful, I said, feeling a surge of profound pride. As they discussed the details, I gazed around the sunlit bookstore. This beautiful, bustling space that represented not just Michael's dream, but a vibrant new chapter for all of us. In the year since the revelation, I had discovered parts of myself that had been dormant for too long. I'd made new friends, developed my painting, even started traveling. Simple weekend trips at first, then 2 weeks in, Italy with a senior tour group, where I'd met Claude, a charming widower from Boston with kind eyes and a dry wit who called me every Sunday without fail. Robert, I thought, would have approved heartily, not just of the bookstore or my newfound independence, but of the firm, unyielding boundaries I'd finally established. He had tried to protect me with his codicil, but in the end, I had learned to protect myself. Jennifer's baby, Roberta, let out a happy gurgle, drawing me back to the comforting present. This was my family now. Not perfect, not complete, but undeniably real. We were building something new, something hopeful, from the ruins of what had been lost. And it was, in its own beautiful way, everything. And it was, in its own beautiful way, everything. What do you think, Grandma? Michael asked, his voice warm, drawing me gently back into their discussion. I smiled, looking first at my intelligent grandson, then at my thoughtful granddaughter, at the tiny baby who represented the boundless hope of our future, and finally, at the sun-drenched shelves of the bookstore itself, a place that had blossomed from genuine trust and mutual respect, rather than from the barren ground of obligation and greed. I think, I said, my voice filled with a quiet certainty, that this is exactly where we're supposed to be.